Good afternoon, class. We're going to wind up the textbook with chapter 10, but before we get into chapter 10, as we've done in all the other chapters, let's go back and just rehash or review for just a second about what we did, what we learned in chapter 9. So in chapter 9, it was more about organizational structure. There was, when you're looking at organizational structure, you've got, remember, you've got vertical linkages. And when we're talking about vertical linkages, it's like most health plans I work for. There's a board of directors, there's a CEO, um, there's maybe a CFO, um, you know, chief actuary, or in my case, chief actuary slash senior VP of operations, and then myself, and then down below, me, were my managers and supervisors and team leads, and then individual contributors. So vertical. That's vertical linkage. And then sometimes you end up with horizontal linkages. So in my case at Blue Cross Blue Shield, not only did I report to the senior VP of operations, but you had a director of risk management, director of actuary, director of medical economics, had some claims directors reporting up to him. And then you had informal linkages. And sometimes these informal linkages can be as significant and as beneficial as some of your vertical linkages and your horizontal linkages, because they are informal. You develop working relationships with different people in different functional areas, and it makes your workload just go a lot more efficient. Common organizational structures, we talked about simple, we talked about functional, and again, in a lot of health plans I work for, functional is kind of that vertical linkage and that horizontal linkage. That's more the functional. You've got multi-divisional, especially in whether it's health plans or large corporations. They may service the entire United States, all 50 states, some of the territories. They may have global offices, and they're going to have multi-divisions, multi-offices, or multi-market maybe locations scattered around. And that's where we get into multi-divisional type structures. And then lastly, the authors talked about the matrix structure. And I've worked in a matrix structure at least once in my life. It was a true matrix structure, and that was United Health Group. And it was extremely beneficial for them. Hadn't worked so well in some other companies, but United Health Group had it down to an art, and it did extremely well for them and the way that they provided health care to the consuming population. And then the authors talk for just a few minutes about boundaryless structure. So you don't hear that too much, but occasionally you'll run into companies with boundaryless structures. And then as far as when the chief executives of a company, whether it's the CEO or the CFO, COO, board, maybe board of directors, when they're trying to determine how the performance is going within the organizational structure and does it need tweaking, they're going to evaluate that performance by what the authors called organizational, control systems. You had output, which for the most part, you're looking at units per FTE, something that's measurable. You've got behavioral controls. You've got clan control. So those are the three types of controls that the authors put forth in the text. And I think you see some of these controls. I've seen some of these controls in every company I work for. Some, depending from one company to the next, some are more prevalent in one and maybe not so prevalent in another. And then they went through the management fads. And again, been through these management fads, management by objective and MBO, you had quality circles, you had sensitivity training, you had organizational culture. And I think all of these fads had a place and time in strategic management and organizations when you're talking about the structure, but I think they have kind of run the gambit and they've had their day in the sun, and now executives are moving on to something else. And then lastly, the authors finished up that chapter 9 talking about just the legal forms of business. You had sole proprietorship, you had You had partnership, and those two legal forms of business. Profits and losses are passed on down to the individual tax forms of each individual in that, whether it's a sole partnership or whether it's sole proprietorship or partnership, it's taxed at the individual level. In corporations, both C corp and S corp, it's taxed not only especially a C corp, you're double taxed at the corporate rate for the corporation, and then what's left over in profits and losses are passed on down to the shareholders. And at that point, it's going to be taxed at the personal level. And then you have S corps taxing a little different because you can only have, it's got to be less than 100 shareholders. C corps are publicly traded. S corps can be publicly traded too, but for the most part, it's the C corps that are publicly traded because S corps have a lot smaller number of shareholders within the corporation. And then lastly was your limited liability LLC, and it's more of it's not really recognized as a at the federal level as a legal form of business. It's more at the state level, and it's got some tax implications that have to be decided upon when you go to form that LLC. And kind of with that as a review of Chapter 9, we're going to move into Chapter 10, and it's talking about leading an ethical organization. And, it talks about corporate governance, it talks about corporate ethics and social responsibility. And it's this text is not unlike a lot of texts that, I've either read or used over time that talked about either leadership or, management or strategic planning. This corporate social responsibility and ethics and corporate governance, it's always relegated kind of to the back of the book. I don't want to say it's an afterthought textbooks, but you will usually find it in textbooks, and especially if you go to a seminar that's talking about leadership and strategic management, that's going to, I don't want to say they brush over it down toward the end, but you're going to find it usually down toward the end of the session that you're sitting in or the session that you're attending. And maybe it's because I've heard individuals at different seminars I've been to laugh and say, corporate ethics, it's kind of like an oxymoron. It's kind of like military intelligence or business intelligence. No, you have to be really careful when you're talking about corporate ethics because you don't know really what the ethics are at any given time at any given corporation. So you just have to be really careful with that. And the authors actually start out the chapter talking about the board of directors. And remember when I talked about Blue Cross Blue Shield or the majority of your large health plans, they have a lot of companies just in general. Well, Fisk has a board of directors sitting on top of it. So, and most universities do. So just about every organization, at least every larger organization, you're probably going to have a board of directors sitting on top that and their responsibility, and we'll get into it as we go down through here, but they have a multitude of responsibilities, especially when it comes to corporate governance, corporate ethics, social responsibility, performance of the organization. And as I said, there are many roles as the board of directors, and the authors actually define a board of directors as a group of individuals, either elected or appointed, that oversees the activities of an organization or corporation. Among other things that, in their roles and responsibilities, they have the ability to hire and fire CEOs. They have the responsibility to manage financial issues, manage operational issues. They have the responsibility to not only the company or the corporation that they are sitting on as a board of directors, but also if it's publicly traded to the shareholders to ensure that the stock price is optimized. What can they do? And it goes back to the financial issues and the operational issues. Are the decisions being made by the management team of that organization in the best interest of the shareholders? And will it keep the stock price not only at a level of expectation in the short run, but will they ensure that the stock price will continue at a level of expectation in the long run? And one of the things that constantly concerned about, for individuals sitting on a board of directors is, kind of corporate governance and, would the company or would the executive team do something to damage the brand or the reputation of the organization? And that's where we get into corporate governance. And the text, again, defines the text has always done a pretty good job in defining terminology throughout the chapters, and they're doing a good job on this one also. And it says the processes, policies, and laws that govern an organization, often it's corporations, to establish accountability and try to eliminate conflicts of interest associated with the principal agent problem. Again, principal agent, you really run into principal agent, especially in healthcare, where if I'm a consumer, I have a health plan. You're a consumer, you more likely are involved in a health plan. You're the principal, you go to talk to your physician, and the physician is your agent. And because of asymmetric information in healthcare, there's typically the potential for a principal agent situation, especially in healthcare when you're going to seek medical services. And it'll be a similar type situation in the corporate world, in a corporate structure. Are the executives of a corporation, and maybe including the board of directors, are they acting as agents in the best interest of the principal? And that's where we're talking about getting into corporate governance. And when you talk about board of directors and their involvement in corporate governance, their responsibilities are, approving of the financial objectives, advising on strategic issues, making companies aware of, newest laws and regulations, representing, stakeholders and shareholders and equity investors. Those all fall under the responsibility of the board of directors. And there have been times in the past where I've worked for a health plan, and Blue Cross Blue Shield was the first not-for-profit healthcare, entity that I worked for, and I'd always worked for, Aetna. I'd worked for Health Net Centene. I'd worked for United Health Group, all publicly traded, all having to worry about earnings per share, all trying to satisfy the stock price and keep it moving in the right direction. And there have been times that while we have done extremely well as a health plan, at the end of the year, when the CFO of the health plan will go to the board of directors and talk about bonuses and those types of financial incentives, board of directors have overruled them and taken that money that would have come to the associates or the employees and rolled it back into the company. It's almost like when corporations, when they have a profit, they can either do retained earnings or they can do dividends. And so it's not out of the ordinary, even though a company's doing well, if the board of directors thinks that the long run vision requires the company at any given point in time to roll those dollars back into the corporation, then they have the authority as the board of directors to do so. Board of directors are constantly concerned, and again, here's where we come into long-term performance. Individuals and groups that have an interest to stake a claim in an organization, and that's shareholders or any other stake in an organization. You want short-term profits and short-term performance, but you also want that long-term financial viability. Boards bring prestige and resources to the organization. At least in theory, a good board is going to bring prestige and resources to an organization. Key stakeholders of a corporation is the shareholder of the company's stock. So if you're a corporation, a C Corp, and you're publicly traded, then your stakeholders are all of your shareholders, and there can be thousands of shareholders. There can be large equity firms that are shareholders. They can be large investment firms. There can be individual stock owners. A lot of different types of individuals and entities can own share of stock in a corporation, and thus they become valid or viable stakeholders. There's always the possibility of conflicts of interest is considerable when you're talking about a public, corporation. What drives long-term versus short-term or short-run decisions? So you've got long-run decisions, you've got short-run decisions, and executives, if they're doing their job, and board of directors also should be looking at the short run and the long run decision making process at the same time and trying to balance those. In their end, conflicts of interest is what drives that agency problem. The interest of individuals who act as agents to manage a company may not align with the interest of the company's stockholders. And they spend a few minutes going through this and talking about it, but it's not unheard of in corporate America that you have this agency problem, and those individuals sitting at the top of the corporation, organization structure, they have financial incentives tied to their performance, and sometimes those financial incentives tied to their performance and the way you calculate and manage performance are not always in the best interest of the shareholders. Composition of the board of directors, and then the authors get into this, that it's critical. You've got board insiders, members of the board of directors who are generally employed inside the organization. I'm not sure I've ever worked for an organization that I can remember that had board insiders. Most of the board of directors on organizations that I've worked within were board outsiders, members of the board of directors who are generally employed outside of the organization. You've also got institutional investors, and you've got institutional investors that are constantly keeping an eye on how many board insiders you have compared to how many board outsiders you have, and is that composition of the board in the best interest of the corporation, not only the corporation, but is it driving the short run and the long-term stock price and company valuation forward in a positive manner? And institutional investors are organizations that invest large sums of money into a board portfolio of holdings, such as banks, retirement funds, 401ks, Warren Buffett. You've got a lot of these institutional investors that have large sums of money invested in these corporations, and they are exposed to a high degree of financial risk. And because of the level of that financial risk, they're going to be constantly watching that board of directors, and their preference would typically be that the composition of the board be made up of board outsiders. You've got CEO duality, and it's something that a lot of people don't talk about because it can get to be a dicey situation. But CEO duality, it's when the chief executive officer is also chairman of the board of directors. Again, it can get really dicey because it's kind of like the fox in the hen house. If you let the fox in the hen house, who's watching the hen house, and that's an issue. And institutional investors are typically going to be somewhat nervous if you have a situation of CEO duality. I can't remember whether Elon Musk falls into that CEO duality. He may have at one time, but I'm not sure whether he still falls into that situation at this point in time. You've got individuals on the board that can be, accountants, they can be lawyers, they can be advisors, they can be activists, they can be HR managers, they can be agents. You have a lot of different roles that fall within this board of directors, but at the end of the day, the responsibility of the board of directors is, and we've gone through a lot of them, but overall, the overall arching of that responsibility of the board of directors is to ensure that the executive team is managing that company in such a way that it is maximizing the utility of the shareholders, or maximizing the value of the company, or maximizing the stock price, whatever economic term you want to use. But in the short run and the long run, they want to ensure that the board of directors is trying to ensure that the management team of that organization is moving that company forward in a positive manner. One of the things that falls under the kind of the hat of the board of directors is managing CEO compensation. Most visible of board roles is selecting and, not only selecting and firing the CEO, but setting the CEO's pay. Corporations, they're going to have to pay a competitive advantage. Again, it's basic economic terms. It's supply and demand. Some of these CEOs out there have a reputation of being the best of the best. And if you're a CEO that's the best of the best, you're going to demand they hire a more generous, let's say a more generous benefit and compensation package than maybe a CEO would demand at a lower level. They're always looking at, when you're talking about managing the CEO compensation, whether it's stock options or bonuses or additional perks, you've got the board of directors are looking at short-term results and also looking at the long-term outlook of the organization. Sometimes it's difficult to tie, compensation to performance on some of these CEOs because there are a lot of extenuating circumstances and outside forces that are impacting the performance of a corporation at any given time. And board of directors are sometimes struggle to tie that performance back to some type of a compensation package. There's also, when just talking about managing CEOs, the authors talk for a few minutes about potential conflict of interest, especially if the compensation package is positively correlated to the size of the company. If it's positively correlated to the size of the company, you have some CEOs that are going to get out there, and we talked about, market penetration and expanding your consumer database and growing a company. They're going to grow the company if it's in their financial best interest, and the board of directors has to spend quite a bit of time and resources ensuring that the growth of the company is going to be in the best interest of both the short-term and the long-term growth of the company. Is an increase in growth in the best, again, is an increase in growth in the best interest of the company, or simply an effort by the CEO to drive up pay raises? When you're talking about CEO compensation, and I think we're looking at CEO compensation, you can almost break it into two components. You either got for-profit or not-for-profit. So CEO compensation, you typically have a guaranteed salary, cash bonuses, stock options, probably not stock options in not-for-profit organizations. I personally have never seen stock options in a not-for-profit organization, but you've got additional perks, country club memberships, flying, if you have to travel, you get to fly first class, free rental cars. You may have a company car that you drive. So strong performance, and all of this ties back into trying to tie the compensation back to a strong performance. And typically, board of directors are looking at leadership and corporate practices, and they want all of this compensation package to be driven by performance in both the short run and the long run. And that's how they're trying to tie it together as a board of directors and move that company forward based on the performance of not only the CEO, but the senior management team in general. And with that, we're going to stop for a few minutes. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the market for corporate performance.